Hello again. I'm Nihat Barkar from Sabancı University, and we're very happy to start our first panel. We're going to have a tough act to follow after these excellent speeches, but I think we will do our best. So the way we will do this is we're going to have 5-minute presentations, thoughts by each one of our panelists, and then after that, I shall have a few questions. We'll take questions from the audience, and let's see what we can do. And I will introduce the speakers, the panelists, as we give them their presentation. We'll start from the far left. No implications there.
That's for sure.
With far left, far right, according to me, whatever. Senator Holmes from Texas. So I give you the word for about 5 minutes, and then we proceed. Thank you very much.
Nihat. I'm very happy to be here. America is blessed to have a boom in the oil and gas business that was largely unexpected. It's a result of 3 technologies that came together. They were all developed in the private sector. Government played no significant role in any of them. And they were all developed independently. One is the ability to look deeper in the ground with dramatic improvement in seismic capacity. This has allowed us to find formations in places we never knew they existed, and most importantly, formations in areas that we thought had been drilled out long, long ago. The second technology is a little bit older, and that is horizontal drilling, the ability to drill one well down and then go horizontally, replacing maybe 10 or 12 wells in some cases with one, dramatically affecting cost. And if you can put that one horizontal shaft into a shale deposit, it's incredibly efficient. And the final technology is an old technology, and that's fracking, something we've been doing in the oil and gas business for a very long time. But when combined with these new technologies, it produces a completely new result. And the combination of these 3 technologies is known by the public now as fracking. There's no real evidence that fracking produces a pollution of groundwater. There have been numerous efforts by groups that would like to stop this technology to prove that it does, and they've been I would say totally unsuccessful in getting clear-cut proof. In some cases, there has been some pollution based on mistakes that were made on the surface, something not totally uncommon in any industry. Finally, let me just say I believe the President will approve the XL pipeline after the election. I think it's been delayed for political reasons, but you now got all of this crude petroleum moving by railroad car, which is inefficient and is very dangerous from a safety point of view. I believe America will export oil and gas. There is a debate going on, but it's a debate basically of special interest against the public interest. I think in the end, the President will support both because environmentalists are going to realize that to restrict the ability to sell natural gas is going to send natural gas prices down even lower, and in the process make sustainable, as we call them, fuel sources less competitive. I think we will export oil because we are producing a lot of it. This whole idea of energy independence is a fraudulent idea. America can never be independent in oil because even if we produce more than we consume, the rest of the world is in a position of being affected by world prices, and so we would be as well. I think we will end up exporting oil through the Gulf, importing oil into the 2 coasts, and that'll be an efficient system. What's going to happen to world oil and gas prices? It's important to remember this is not a static technology. Oil companies are now working to use natural gas instead of water in fracking. They're working to use jet engines instead of water in fracking. A breakthrough in this area would dramatically expand the capacity to produce shale oil and gas, and I never bet against technology. In my whole career as an economist and a politician and now as a banker, people have talked about running out of resources. It doesn't happen because technology progresses faster than resource depletion. Our great-grandchildren are going to live in the petroleum age, and if you look at the long-term history of resource prices, it's always down over any secular period. So I'm very optimistic about the future. Final point, this decline, especially in natural gas prices, is going to hold out the potential of reindustrializing America, because now we have cheaper energy prices than any country in the world, and so industries that are heavily impacted by energy costs are going to find America very attractive. And as a result, this is creating a huge potential impact on the economy.
Thank you very much, Senator Graham. And we will proceed now and take questions later on, if that's quite okay with you. But would you have to leave early?
Yeah, I have 3 grandchildren that are going to be waiting for me in front of Hagia Sophia. So I love Goulair Sabanci, and that's why I'm here, but I love my grandchildren more.
So do we, should we wait for our, should we take the questions?
So I'm just going to quietly slip out at 1.
So maybe we should take the questions to Senator Graham, if my fellow panelists agree, now to leave you a free hand to do the disappearing act whenever you want, and then we can proceed, okay? So I will, why don't I start out with a question? So based on what you're saying, has there been any movement of energy-intensive industries into the U.S. and therefore helping, for example, the job market going on? Have you seen that movement yet?
Yeah, I think America is a huge potential gainer from this oil and gas production. I think we will have this privileged position for some time. We benefit by having private ownership of mineral resources. That creates a political pressure to exploit those resources. Other countries don't have that system, and as a result, they don't have the political base to develop as we do. But you've got to assume this technology will spread worldwide at some point, and we're probably looking at a 10 or 20-year advantaged period that America has. I don't think this advantage is permanent, but 10 or 20 years is a long time in the world we live in.
Thank you. Well, let's take a few questions from the audience before proceeding with our panel. Some questions for Senator Graham. Nobody has one. There's one from the panel.
Yes, before you leave, I'm John Holmes from Canada. Thank you very much for your comments on Keystone XL. Obviously, something that we're very interested in.
Thank you for being a great neighbor.
Well, I hope your optimism is right. But I just wanted your reaction to the point that Melanie made earlier. How do you see prospects for the U.S. getting into the export LNG market? As she mentioned, a bit controversial, but again, we don't see ourselves as a competitor, but a complementary approach to export. So how do you see that playing out?
Well, I think that it's controversial in the sense that there's always somebody who goes to Washington to try to make a case that their interest should be promoted and not the country's interest. But in any kind of sense of fairness, the whole idea of limiting export limits people's freedom. And I believe this will be overcome, and one of the reasons I'm convinced it will is that environmentalists, who are very influential with the president, are going to figure out it would be a disaster for them to let natural gas prices in America fall further by artificially restricting exports, because solar and wind power in America are totally a product of federal subsidies. And they're becoming less and less and less competitive as natural gas prices go down. And so if you believe that future mankind depends on solar and wind energy, I do not. But if you do believe that, then you're going to want to do something about this glut of natural gas in America, and the natural thing to do is export it.
If I can summarize in one sentence, limiting exports, isn't it in some ways equivalent to giving energy subsidies for which we criticize many other governments and creating this unnatural situation?
Well, America is very good at criticizing other governments for doing what it does.
I didn't mean it that way.
Hypocrisy is not a sin in a collective system. It is a sin for private people, but government tends to view itself as exempt. But in the end, both these restrictions are going to be overcome, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, let's see if there are more questions while we invite the senator to stay with us as much as he can hold on to, but we will proceed with our panel then. Then we go to our next panelist, Dave Sanyal, the Executive Vice President and Group Chief of Staff of BP. Please, Dave.
Well, Nihat Bey, thank you very much for having me here. It's great to be back in a country where I spent 2 very happy years a decade or so ago. I joined the oil business 25 years ago out of university in the United States. And in those days, the fashionable idea was peak oil. I think what we've seen, as Senator Grimm very wisely commented on, is that the idea of peak oil has somewhat peaked. In fact, one of the great geologists of the 20th century, Park Dickey, once said, whenever we thought we were running out of oil, we discovered we were running out of ideas. So technology changes everything. And one of the big lessons of America is that it's not just the technology, it's all the above-ground conditions that have actually created this extraordinary dividend for the United States and for North America. And I'm actually fond of saying that below-ground conditions are important, but above-ground conditions are absolutely compelling for the monetization of the resource base. Back when I was in university 25 years ago, the total amount of proven reserves in the world was around 1,000 billion barrels. In the meanwhile, in the 25 years from the time I graduated, we have consumed around 700 billion barrels, and today proven reserves sit at 1,600 billion barrels. And so the question you've got to ask is, why is it that the peak oil theorists actually got their moment in the sun 25 years ago? Well, because they actually had a very static view of technology. They had a very static view of the world of innovation. And when I look at the United States, you look at the Bakken. In 2007, the Bakken was producing 200,000 barrels of oil. Today, the Bakken produces 1 million barrels of oil. America, just 10 years ago, the forecast from the EIA was that America would essentially be importing a lot of oil, a lot of gas. In fact, the forecasts were widely wrong. America today imports only half what was forecast just a decade ago, and in terms of natural gas, is actually a third. So an extraordinary game changer. And the question, therefore, is, in this point of plenty, what has actually created this sufficiency? Well, actually, the above-ground conditions. When I look at the United States, the conditions of technology, innovation, capability, and actually very, very fluid capital markets have created this extraordinary cocktail that we are seeing flow through into the real economy in terms of America's competitiveness. The real question is, can this revolution, which sounds bombastic, but I think it is a revolution, can this be replicated around the world? Because there is shale in Asia, there is shale in Argentina, there is shale in Africa, there is shale in Europe. But actually, the scale of developments that we've seen in the United States has not been replicated. And the big policy question is, can the above-ground conditions, if you will, marry up with the below-ground conditions in many other parts of the world? So the big challenge of sufficiency is, I think, been proven that there is enough oil, and at some point the age of oil will come to an end. But I will remind you the Stone Age did not come to an end because we ran out of stones. Something else came along. So the reality is the challenge of sufficiency is one that I think the industry has been meeting in an extraordinary way. The second sort of big challenge is around security, which is to do with essentially how do you ensure secure and reliable supplies of energy to lubricate the global economy, to lubricate national economies. And I think Fukushima is very instructive, because what happened is, in one fell swoop, 30% of electricity generating capacity of Japan went out, and yet the world was able to digest it. So this entire notion that people talk of energy independence, I don't quite like. What I think the last few years has proven is that energy interdependence works, markets work, and effectively the broad caricature of what happened post-Fukushima is gas from Europe went to Asia, and coal from America, which was exiled due to the shale revolution, went to Europe. So the world was able to digest what was seemingly an indigestible occurrence at the time. What we do know is that today 50% of proven reserves of oil are in 4 countries. 50% of proven reserves of gas are in 4 countries. And 50% of demand of oil is in 5 countries. And therefore, the reality is, when you look at the people who are on the demand side of the equation, and if you look at the growth in our industry over the next 2 decades, 95% is coming from the non-OECD, led by China and India. And if you look at where the producers are, in the case of gas, we're looking at Turkmenistan, Qatar, Iran. In the case of oil, you're looking at Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela, Canada. You know, the dynamics are interesting, because without traded markets, without markets that lubricate commerce, there would be a problem. And the reality is markets have worked, and that's something that is incredibly important as one looks at the dynamic moving forward. The third challenge, which is another S, is sustainability. So the question, of course, is, as previous speakers have spoken about, how do we ensure that we do see progress in the world economy, at the same time we do so without an unacceptable cost on the environment? And here's my own personal observation. Prior to the financial crisis of 2008, the focus was very much on the end state. I think the reality is that the end state actually does create, if you will, an interesting dynamic, but it does not actually provide enough of an urgency to what can be done in the short to medium term. And areas of efficiency are very important, but actually, when you take a step back, if you look at the United States, the greenhouse gas emission levels in the United States are back down to the levels of 1995. Why is that? Well, because of the shale revolution, because coal was exiled, if you will, to Europe. And the real sort of challenge is, how can we actually see a transition from coal to gas in the world? Because the reality is, a 1% increase in gas at the expense of coal has the same environmental impact as an 11% increase in renewables. So renewables are an incredibly important part of the overall mix. But the reality is, in the short to medium term, the transition to a gas economy does have an extraordinary impact, and sustainability in that context needs to be reframed from, if you will, just the end state. So, taking a sort of step back from a macro perspective, the 3 sort of challenges of sufficiency, the challenge of security, and the challenge of sustainability have been redefined as we've gone along. And no doubt will get further redefined as we move forward. What I'm not going to do is start forecasting what's going to happen, because as Paul Samuelson said, if you forecast often. But what I will say is that technology and the above ground conditions are incredibly important to deal with some of these big challenges that we see. And, you know, Fatih Bey spoke about a $48 trillion investment that is required. I mean, that's sort of put in perspective. That's 2.2% of the world GDP. It's an extraordinary investment requirement. But the right conditions will create the right innovations the right capabilities, and therefore the right outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. So we now proceed with Dimitris Tsitsigraos, Vice President, International Finance Corporation, World Bank. Dimitris.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be back here. You heard we started talking about the impact that U.S. has had in the oil and gas markets around the world, and I'll take it a little bit from the perspective of the countries that we focus on in IFC and the World Bank Group, which is the emerging markets. The U.S. is a game changer. The developments in the U.S. is a game changer, and at the same time, they impact the trade patterns and the impact developments in emerging markets. So what you see is, you look at Africa today. In 2013, U.S. was importing about 40,000 barrels of Nigerian oil. The same figure 4 years ago was about 230,000 barrels a day. So that's one pattern that changes. I think also you see what happens in the Middle East. A lot of the crude from the Middle East is going towards East Asia. The demand is in East Asia and South Asia, but at the same time there's a lot less, the U.S. needs a lot less oil from the Middle East. So that has also trade implications. I think beyond that one, the developments in the U.S. also have implications for a lot of the oil exporting countries. And they have implications from the problem from the point of view is that they need to make some changes at their own policies and the way they develop. And they need to reduce their reliance on exporting oil. They need to diversify their economies. So there is pressure on oil prices and gas prices as a result of developments in the U.S. You've got the geopolitical risks. You've got uncertainties about supply and demand, which is, has been exacerbated as a result of the crisis in 2008. And that puts downward pressures in number of these countries. And what I say downward pressures is the fiscal regimes, and a lot of them are based on certain oil price assumptions. If oil prices go down, that creates pressures in these countries. And one of the things that we see as a challenge, and we talked about it last year and here, and I think Fatih mentioned it earlier on as well, is the element of subsidies. I mean, subsidies in the oil exporters are huge. Oil subsidies around the world represent about 2.5% of the global GDP. So when you deal with this type of situation and you have pressures on oil prices, I think that creates also an interesting situation for these countries and has, I would say, political implications. It's something one has to think about. Now, as I talked about diversification, this is key for these countries. I think the other thing is also what happens is, what you see is that oil and gas developments, and we talked about the U.S. The U.S. was lucky in many ways because the U.S. had the infrastructure. The U.S. has the technology. The U.S. has a very healthy and strong industry in the private sector that can take on can take on shale and develop it. The rest of the world does not necessarily have the same infrastructure. I think also what you see around the world is happening is that new oil and gas types of oil and gas developments are happening in the most difficult parts of the world, the less developed part of the world. They're also becoming a lot more expensive, and I think that creates a challenge in itself. You also have developments, everybody was looking at Brazil, as the next big opportunity. A lot of money went into Brazil. Then you've got the Ike Batista story that in a way threw cold water in a lot of people's interests in Brazil and developments in the country. The other thing that we've been seeing is that interest in global oil and gas project financing has been going down, and I think the volume is like about 3% less in 2013. And Fatih also talked about the need to developing different types of sources of financing. One advantage that you heard it from Dave earlier on has the U.S. The U.S. had the capital markets, and I think Senator Graham's talked about the same thing. You don't have developed capital markets around the world that can go out and support, oil and gas developments or energy developments in general. Traditionally, this is a market that in emerging markets have been supported by the banking sector. The banking sector in recent years has been pulling away from this market. So who is going to finance these projects, I think, is becoming very important for us. The other thing is, development costs are getting much higher. It's 3 times as expensive to develop oil and gas projects today as it was in 2010. And I think that also plays a role in the way companies look at projects. The other thing you've had a number of projects that have had huge cost overruns. And that also has dampened the appetite for the high risk, high reward type of projects in many places. I think then the last thing that comes to mind is also how the governments view energy, and their whole energy policy of governments plays a role in the appetite of oil companies. You look at this vicinity, for example, one country that comes to mind is Egypt. The energy policy in Egypt, I mean, has had quite an impact in the way in how investors look at the country, and how a number of operators over there, look at further investments in the country. The potential is good. The need is very large, but if you don't get the energy policy right, you're not going to get the investments that you need. And that creates social pressures, because and also, I mean, we look at it in the World Bank Group. People ask, why are you investing in this business? And why are you looking at energy? Why are you looking at oil and gas? And we look at it as that it's key to addressing, the two goals that we have, which is trying to eradicate extreme poverty and also boost shared prosperity. If people don't have access to energy, you cannot develop an industry. They cannot run businesses. And I think that is the opportunity, but is also the challenge, and this is what we try to address. Now, having said that one, I think we see a couple of opportunities here. And one of the themes that maybe I would want to put on the table is that going forward, there is interdependence. There are the global trends, but also this business in many ways can become a local business. One theme that I think is very important, and it has to do with climate change, but also has to do with addressing the local challenges, is the gas to power. I think gas to power is very important, and that's something we have to look at. I mean, if you look at, say, Nigeria, I mean, you have the highest number, a lot of flaring takes place in Nigeria. And you look at the needs of Nigeria, they need about 35 gigawatts of power generation by 2020. The installed capacity today is 8 gigawatts. And then they continue to flare gas. This is gas that they can use, to just develop, just power, to fuel, to power plants for themselves. You have developments in East Africa, a lot of discoveries in East Africa. One can look at potentials for a regional developments, regional grids, and I think that is what we see. We see this as an opportunity. We talked earlier on about Eastern Mediterranean. Yes, there are the geopolitics of Eastern Mediterranean, but if one looks at Eastern Mediterranean as one market and thinks about some sort of a regional grid, and I said the seeds for that one have already been planted. You can think about how developments can transform the region. So, in closing, I would say the local aspect is very important. So we can think about globally in oil and gas, but we also have to think about local possibilities and local opportunities.
Well, thank you very much. We now proceed with His Excellency James Larson, Ambassador of Australia, please.
Thank you very much. I will say at the outset that one of the advantages of inviting a diplomat to speak on a specialised topic like this is that they'll be short, because they don't know anything. I exclude my colleague from Canada. The disadvantage is that they run the risk of being boring. But can I say the obvious, which is that Australia is a multi-resource economy. And so if you look at where we come from, coal is a fundamental component of our resource infrastructure. It's a critical export. It's a critical provider for us for our domestic electricity production. And Fatih Bey, I think, made the point that coal's days are not over. Coal is still significantly cheaper than gas. And so a country like Australia, where we have, I think, the fourth largest reserves of coal in the world, we're the world's fourth largest coal exporter, we are continually seeking to refine the way we use coal and the technology we use in relation to coal to ensure that it continues to be an environmentally acceptable but also competitive energy source. Australia also, of course, we're both an oil importer and exporter, and I think where you're seeing a really radical transformation of the Australian energy landscape is on the gas side. We have very, very substantial reserves of conventional gas and exceedingly substantial reserves potentially of unconventional gas. And you've seen in the last several years a dramatic expansion of our gas exports driven both by Asian demand, Japan, Korea and China, but also driven by, I think, the accessibility, the growing accessibility of gas sources in Australia. We have an investment pipeline in Australia of something like $170 billion in general gas projects, of which something like $50 billion are related to unconventional gas sources. So gas, LNG and unconventional gas are absolutely critical contributors to the way we see our energy exports proceeding into the future. What I'd say about Australia and where Australia stands out, and it goes to a point made by Melanie, I think, in her presentation of the work done by the US in preparing for coal seam gas, shale gas production. It's a 30-year project. These things take a lot of time. They require a lot of infrastructure investment, but they also require an effective regulatory environment. Australia has done that with reasonable success, I think, but not with overwhelming success. Part of the challenge for Australia is that we're a federal system, so the national government controls, for example, offshore activity. So I think our offshore LNG activity, which has been a very, very strong part of our export profile for some 40 to 50 years, that's been largely seamless and very successful. I think we're increasingly seeing in the onshore unconventional gas resource development where you potentially have great prospects. You're seeing the challenge of state governments having been responsible for much of the key elements of how you advance this. The current federal government is committed to doing something about that. It's committed to having a one-stop shop for environmental processing and regulation. It's worked with the state governments to have a uniform approach. But even with that work underway, I think in a community like a society like Australia, you have some real challenges when you're talking about unconventional energy. You have the environmental issues and concerns that have been raised in relation to fracking, obviously. You have alternative land uses, farming, residential. You have community concerns. You have issues of cost. Producing unconventional gas in Australia is relatively high cost, and that means by the time you take transport into account, if you've converted into LNG, you're talking about a relatively high-cost product. So you want to be very confident, I think, that your investment is going to be able to come to fruition and produce results within a reasonable time frame. One final comment I'd make is that while there was a lot of hubris and excitement, say 2 or 3 years ago, about unconventional gas in Australia, and a lot of talk about massive increases in production, I think the reality has proved a little bit different. It's actually that the exploration processes have been much slower than many producers expected. I think the upfront investment costs have been quite substantial. That's not a reason not to proceed, but it is pause for thought. It does go back to that point, I think, which is you're talking about a very, very long-term process.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now we proceed then with Brian Davis, Vice President of Group Strategy in Shell. Please, Brian.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I, like Dev, am returning to a place where I worked for a couple of years early in my career in Shell. Indeed, immediately after getting married, I moved here. So it has fond memories to be back in Istanbul. What I thought I might do, given that my role these days is in the strategy department at Shell, so I'm accountable for the strategy for the whole company, but I have worked in business before. I had intended to tell you something about the outlook for markets and trends and what have you, but I realize I'm somewhat humbled by the quality of the presenters that came before me, and indeed my panelists. So I think you've largely heard a lot of the stories around how the markets could evolve over the medium to longer term. And maybe I'd just make a placeholder here that we've been doing scenario work in Shell for over 40 years, and we've most recently updated our scenarios. And if you'd like to get our perspective on that, you're probably best to go and get the materials off our website, which are quite a good explanation of how we see possible ranges to the future. But what I thought might be quite nice to add to the discussion right now is that ultimately strategy is about making choices, and it's about deciding what you will and won't do and where you'll allocate your resources. And so from a private sector point of view, we need to continue to be driving the company forward, looking for opportunities and taking on the challenges and resolving them, so we play our part in sort of powering the energy of the future. So I think that's an interesting angle maybe to explore. And I think what's particularly important here is that the decisions that we make as a company, and indeed the policymakers are making right now, are going to be impacting the energy system in the next 20 to 30 years. Because often some of the more challenging oil and gas projects have quite long life cycles from maturation. So from when you first think about exploring for oil to eventually having a mature system could be even longer than the sort of 5 to 10 years that Fatih mentioned. Some of these plays can even be out to, in frontier areas, can be much longer. And indeed, there were references to the shale gas revolution in North America, and that's been quite a long time coming. But we should also recognize that whilst the potential outside North America is quite great, in terms of wells drilled, there's maybe over 100,000 wells in dry gas in North America, 20 to 30,000 in liquids rich, and I think it's maybe 1,000 outside the rest of the world. So they're all on different stages of maturation. And that's not to say the potential won't be released, but it may take longer than we think. So from our perspective, then the question is, how do we understand and navigate that going forward? And what we've been doing is we've been focusing on the fact that we still need to continue to bring on resources in the near term. Because with natural decline in oil fields and indeed growth, the oil fields are declining at 3 or 4 million barrels a day. The market is growing at 1 million. So just simply to sort of, you've got to run fast to stand still, I think was your quote, Fatih, and I think it's very valid. And that's something that all of our industry spends a lot of time focusing on and a lot of commitment. And meanwhile, we recognize that the energy system is going through a transition of an uncertain type over an uncertain time frame. And we intend to be part of that transition. And in order to do that, we have to be making measured developments and technology plays and what have you in multiple areas. Indeed from renewables, but also through into unlocking unconventionals and continuing to work on the technology dimension. We've talked a lot about shale gas, and there's a very important technology piece in making shale gas a success. But what I'd also say, because there are references to LNG, is that the LNG market is one where technology's played a key role. And indeed, Shell has been a leader in LNG, and we intend to stay in that leadership position, but it requires constant technology innovation. We've found technologies that can turn gas into oil products, which we've successfully commercialized in Qatar. So that may be part of a future solution. Likewise, as we move into deeper water, we need different technologies, and there are a number of companies who are particularly strong in that area. And if we're going to unlock some of these frontier deep water basins, the technology, the creativity, the innovation, the ingenuity of the industry will be absolutely critical to making that a success. So that's what I'd offer into the debate that we as an industry can do. And we're ultimately about trying to find opportunities to create value in a sustainable way. And clearly that's value for multiple people. It's value for the stakeholders, for the countries in which our products go to, for indeed also for our shareholders. And the sustainable element is important. So we have to get the balance right as we take on and address the challenges of the future. So with that, I think I'd stop and hand it over.
Perfect. On time. Thank you very much. And now for His Excellency John Holmes, Ambassador of Canada. Please, John.
Well, this is where the chair normally says we've saved the best for last, but I second the comments of
Consider that said.
I second the comments of my colleague. Ambassadors know not very much, but about a lot of subjects. But the one thing about ambassadors, give us half a day and we're suddenly experts, or we try to sound like experts. I want to agree with Brian by thanking our speakers from this morning. I think they did an excellent job of setting the context and flagging some of the key issues that energy-producing countries, energy-consuming countries will face in the foreseeable future. And I just want to draw on a few points that were raised and then build on those for my own ideas. First of all, I think a conclusion that we can all agree on is that for the foreseeable future, probably till 2030, according to Daniel Jürgen, we'll still continue to rely on the usual traditional sources of energy, whether it be oil and gas, whether it be coal, which is making a comeback, and the renewables that we're using today. So as we look forward, what are the best options? And certainly we've heard from speakers the concerns about climate change, the concerns about costs. Is coal the right solution? It can be, as our colleague from Japan said, if we have high-efficient, clean coal. But if we revert back to dirty coal, if you will, then certainly globally we face real challenges. And a number of speakers, particularly Melanie and others, have focused on the geopolitical issues that we face. A year ago, we weren't worried about Russia except as a supplier of gas to Europe and Turkey and elsewhere. A major concern for all of us now. Iran certainly, I think, remains a concern, certainly for my country. Yes, it is making efforts to try to get back into the international community, to deal with its nuclear issue, but we have very strong concerns about where Iran is going, and in our hemisphere, Venezuela as well. If you look at some of the long-term solutions that we discussed earlier, some of the panelists have raised, several have mentioned the long-term complexity of developing new solutions. I mentioned Mr. Jürgen. He estimates that while right now we use about over 80% of energy sources come from carbon-based. For 2030, he's estimating it'll go down only to about 75%. That's significant, and we should encourage that, and I want to come back to it. But it still means that we must rely on these traditional sources. But there's a number of areas where we can improve, and certainly Canada is trying to be a leader in these areas. Energy efficiency. These aren't sexy. These aren't photo ops where you're opening a new LNG plant or you're opening new shale gas facilities. But they can make a real difference in terms of energy consumption, whether it's through households, automobile transmission or emissions controls, business, and the like. Certainly for Canada, a very cold country, actually a country that has extremes of climate, very hot summers, very cold winters. Energy efficiency is very high on our priority, and we have a number of companies that are leading edge and are working in different parts of the world, including here in Turkey. Sustainability, we talked a little bit about climate change. Access to energy has to be balanced with new environmental safeguards, and certainly Canada recognizes this, but we also recognize and appreciate that global problems, and climate change is a global problem, require global solutions. So for Canada, we see approaches that are both hemispheric as well as global as being required. And again, I'm borrowing here a bit from Mr. Jürgen, who's written quite extensively on energy business, but he talks about the need for innovation and conviction. We talked a little bit about new solutions to our energy needs, and these are coming from the private sector, as our colleagues from Shell and BP mentioned. But Mr. Jürgen and I wholeheartedly agree, and my government agrees, that these have to be sustained, and they have to be joint efforts by governments, by the private sector, and by the public. And also they must be global. The solutions don't necessarily have to come from the United States, from MIT, or from Canada, McGill, my own university. I always have a little push there. Increasingly, the solutions are going to come from China, from Chile, and from Turkey. And I want to congratulate Mrs. Sabanji for creating this institute. IICEC, I can't pronounce it, IICEC. But these kinds of initiatives are very needed for developing the solutions. Couple of just quick points on Canada. We are an energy superpower. We have fifth largest oil and gas production in the world. We have, depending on the technology, anywhere from the third largest reserves in the world to perhaps the second largest reserves. Our challenge, which Mr. Senator Graham mentioned, is getting it to the market. So right now, 99% of our produce products go to the United States. We see very much an integrated continental market. We will continue to sell to our friends, but we're also looking increasingly abroad. And yes, Asia is a strong pull, but we also see markets in Europe. And we're very open to business. I just want to comment quickly on the investment angle. I think it was Dr. Birrell mentioned the impact of state-owned companies around the world, both as producers as well as consumers. And Canada is largely private sector, so we welcome investment. We very much see great potential. It's hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that we need to invest in infrastructure and development. And with one small exception, these state-owned companies, we generally welcome investment from around the world. And certainly the aim of my embassy and my consulate general is to get more Turkish companies interested in investing in Canada. We see great opportunities, and I think our colleagues would find that as well if they came to Canada and look to invest. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. And speaking of being relevant to the topic, I'm a theoretical physicist, so I can try to explain everything by circles. But now we're passing on to questions, and I will kick off the questions with one myself, and then I will go to the audience. This is to Ambassador Holmes. As you say, Canada is potentially an energy superpower, and the main thing is the export, being able to bring this outside to the whole world. And this brings me to climate change, global warming. It seems treacherous to kind of use global warming, but under the effect of global warming, we wish it weren't there. Are there studies of the northern passages opening up, either over Eurasia or over America, and this improving the export situations?
Thank you very much. Very, very good question, because I did want to briefly mention one area where the government is extremely concerned, and that is the Arctic. I think there's been enough studies that have been done recognizing that the impact of climate change, which, while it affects every region, has an extra impact on the Arctic. And Canada is working very closely with this new international organization called the Arctic Council, which is a unique international organization in that it brings together the countries of the Arctic region, as well as indigenous groups, Aboriginal groups from my country, as well as from a number of countries. And Canada is investing, as are the Americans, as are Scandinavian countries, in studies on the impacts, not only of the Northwest Passage, which I'll come back to, but also development of resources. We believe that there are tremendous energy potential in the Arctic throughout both Canada, US, Scandinavia, and Russia. But these have to be developed with even stronger environmental safeguards than perhaps are applied in other areas. On the Northwest Passage, we have a different opinion than some of our close friends. We believe these are internal waters, as defined by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and therefore we have environmental standards that we've already adopted, but these have to be adapted. We believe that inevitably, whether it's 10 years from now or 30 years from now, the Northwest Passage will present an opportunity for shipping, and we will consult, work with other partners, but ultimately take the measures that are necessary to protect our Arctic and the Aboriginal people who live there.
Well, we'll take questions from the audience. I see a question right there. If you can bring the microphone.
Thank you. Nabil Kuwaiter from Saudi Arabia. Earlier today, Fatih Birol mentioned two important trends which are related. One is the increasing role of governments in the regulation and the direction of energy and related investments. And two is, of course, the fact that these same investments will decide future consumption patterns and future investments in other alternative energy sources. My question is there currently in existence an international body, a think tank or a center of excellence that is neutral, such as associated with the IFC, the World Bank, or the UN, that could guide countries around the world that do not have a long history of dealing with natural resource regulations in negotiating with international oil companies? And the reason I say this is because I have been party to many times very long, year-long, multi-year-long negotiations that involve developing countries, let's say, that do not have highly representative governments. And the reason these negotiations take forever is in many cases the sense from the governments and from their citizens that somehow they're being manipulated or that they'll be abused in the long term. If there was in existence a neutral think tank associated with one of the international organizations, could it potentially help developing countries formulate regulatory structures for their energy industries that would speed up future negotiations, because both technocrats and citizens in the countries would have a neutral source of advice that could not be attacked or seen as, say, supporting an elite group within that country. And this is because these countries don't have highly representative governments, and elites in these countries could be seen as colluding with international oil companies. Thank you.
So, Dave, maybe you want to take the question? Who's going to take the question?
I'm very happy to take the question, and it's a very important subject, because when you look back in time, one of the challenges in resource-rich economies has been the so-called Dutch disease, when effectively the sudden injection of wealth that is caused as a result of a resource dividend can, if it's not managed well, create a resource curse. So the point that you raise is incredibly important. I do believe there are many different fora that look into this particular subject. There is a group called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, of which BP is a member. But also in this same initiative, you've got civil society, NGOs, and you've got host governments who are members. And one of the challenges that the EITI looks at is how do we ensure that revenues are managed in the way that creates the greatest possible beneficial impact to society at large. Taking a step back, from a company perspective, there's a perfect symmetry of interests between ourselves and countries where we invest in to ensure that the investment is long-term. The nature of our industry is when you invest some money, it takes some time. In fact, a lot of time before you can monetize that investment, decades. So we do have a long-term perspective in the way we manage our investment flows. Equally, one is to manage the revenue flows in a very long-term way so that there is actually that perfect symmetry of interest between ourselves and the societies in which we operate. So I think things like EITI are getting at the heart of the matter, but that is not enough. And there are other think tanks, other institutions. The World Bank and IFC, I think, play an incredibly important role in terms of helping host governments manage through this resource dividend so that it becomes indeed a dividend for the long term as opposed to a curse for the long term.
Yes, and Dimitris, you would like to add?
Yeah, I think Dev took what I was going to say at the end. Is the challenge in many ways is building capacity at the government level to deal with these contracts. And one has to think about these contracts, the need for them to be sustainable and sustainable for the long term. EITI is a very good initiative, but part of the, I think, link to EITI is what one needs is communication and transparency. Sometimes perception is worse than reality, so communication up front is very important about what are the risks, what are the opportunities. And planning is also key, because the challenge is how you diversify these economies. I mean, you get all these flows of money coming in, but then what do you do with it? And I think today one has an opportunity and a challenge on how East African countries are going to deal with these big flows of revenues coming in. I think that's one area that organizations like ourselves are quite engaged in and see how we can help. It's easier said than done. It's a long-term process. It's a long-term engagement. But I think this planning is something that has to be done up front. And you have examples where things have worked well, but there are other cases where the track record is poor. I mean, what I think as positive is that a number of countries around the world have created these sovereign wealth funds where a lot of the oil proceeds are going in. And what you see is that that has made a difference in many countries, because you don't get a lot of noise around how this money has been used and has been allocated. So that, I think, is a positive step.
Thank you. More questions from the audience. Well, I have to sacrifice myself and ask another question. This is going to go to Ambassador Larson. Now, with respect to Australia and its importance in coal production export, now there are two types of, and I'm talking like a physicist, but two types of fluctuations, short-term and long-term. Short-term fluctuations in the exchange rate, which can go quite up and down with the Australian dollar, and also long-term fluctuation. It's not a fluctuation, it's a trend of American coal coming to Europe and being less expensive. Now, how does Australia deal with the situation with both of these type of uncertainties or threats?
This is where I go back to my earlier caveat and claim the lack of expertise. I mean, I think at the end of the day, our coal sales are entirely governed by the private sector. Private companies deal with it, and so that would be part of the strategic planning of the private enterprises which run our coal industry.
Okay, fair enough. More questions. I'm not going to go for a third question myself, so this is your chance. Well, if not, it's getting late and we're ready for lunch. Let's thank all the previous speakers and our panelists. Thank you very much.